Awesome, cool. So I'm going to give an explanation today about how the brain can work in relation to OCD. So if you imagine we've got that's a pretty poor picture of a brain. We've got different areas of the brain which are important to us. First of all, we've got the prefrontal cortex, or what we call as the conscious area of the brain, which is the bit of the brain that sits just behind our forehead, and it's the bit that makes us aware of who we are. It's the conscious area of the brain. It's the bit that says, "I think, therefore I am." And at the moment, that area of the brain is attached to a vast intellectual resource, which we call the intellectual area of the brain. The scientific name is the cerebral cortex. But when we're operating from that area of the brain, we can take a look at any given situation and come up with an appropriate response. Yeah. So this area of the brain doesn't do OCD. It doesn't do obsessional thoughts. It doesn't do obsessional behaviours or any of that kind of stuff. So when we're operating from that area of the brain, we're generally getting life right. Yeah. Now there's another area of the brain which we call the original, or the primitive emotional area of the brain, and the central and influential area of that brain is the amygdala. Now the amygdala is often referred to as the fight, flight, freeze area of the brain. And people often nickname it the health and safety officer. Yeah, it's associated with two other primitive parts, the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus stores all of our previous patterns of behaviour, our behavioural templates and things like that. And it's not unusual to find somebody who's struggling with perhaps an hygiene OCD, who's got a template in that hippocampus, who's got a very strong compulsion to keep washing their hands. Or another one is obviously not being able to walk out of the room without switching the lights on and off for 15 times. And then we've got the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus controls chemical responses both in the body and in the brain. So let's imagine for a moment that we're walking down the street one day and we happen to come across a polar bear. What is going to happen? Our anxiety levels will shoot through the roof. We will lose intellectual control, and we will move from that clear thinking, sensible, intellectual area of the brain into the emotional, primitive area of the brain. Okay? Heart rate will go up, blood pressure will go up, muscle spindles will tighten, and we'd leg it. And under the circumstances, that is an entirely appropriate response. We'll probably get 400 or 500 yards down the road, and we'd think, why on earth is there a polar bear in the middle of the high street? Yeah? But unfortunately, it is the same in life. And as our anxiety levels start to increase, and there may or may not be some events in our lives that cause a spike, which we may or may not recover from, but as our anxiety levels start to increase, to a greater or lesser extent, we spend more and more time in this primitive area of the brain. So if this primitive area of the brain thinks that for one reason or another our life is in some kind of crisis, it will step in generally to help out. Now we know that this primitive area of the brain can only operate within the primitive parameters of depression, anxiety, and or anger, or a combination of those three things. So the primitive area of the brain can only operate within the primitive parameters of depression, anxiety, and or anger. So what do I mean about that? Depression, if a caveman or woman, early man, early woman, was to look out of the cave and see snow, ice and danger, they'd probably think to themselves, oh, I don't fancy that very much. They'd pull the blankets back over their head. They'd not interact until the situation has changed. A feeling of lethargy, a feeling of lack of motivation, and everything else that comes along with that. Now, under the circumstances, that's an entirely appropriate response. Metabolic rate falls through the floor. They can survive without food for that much longer. Anxiety. If our early man or early woman was to be walking through the jungle and there's a sense that there's a wild boar over there's a wild tribesman over there's a polar bear over there, then there's a very strong compulsion to keep checking. Never too far away from that panic button. Never too far away from that moment of panic. And then anger anger's just a primitive way of us hitting harder or running faster if it comes to it. So this primitive area of the brain can only operate within those three primitive opt-out clauses. So what is it then that causes us the anxiety that moves us from this clear thinking, sensible, intellectual area of the brain into the primitive? So it's not the events in our lives that cause us the perception of stress, it's our thought processes around the events in our lives. So it's typically negative thinking. Yep. There's more. This primitive area of the brain has certain characteristics. First of all, it is obsessional. So if we perceive that we have a polar bear in our back garden, there's a very strong compulsion to keep thinking about it, to keep checking on it. And that makes sense. If we've got a polar bear in our back garden, it's useful to make sure it's not chewing through the back door and he's going to come and eat us. Yeah? But actually, that's not so good if we're thinking to ourselves, well, actually, have I got to put the handbrake on in the car? Or have I turned the gas off? Or have I turned that light switch on and off? Or have I... Yeah? With a polar bear, it's useful, but in modern day life, it isn't. So it is obsessional. It is also vigilant. It's constantly on a state of high alert, both internally, so what's happening in our internal environment, but also what's happening in our external environment. Yeah? Is there something that we should be frightened of in this social gathering? Is there something happening inside me? Oh, there's a thought, and I don't want to have that thought. Oh, no, I don't. But actually, it might just be a genuine thought of, have I remembered to pack my lunch today for work? Yeah? So it might just be a natural thought. But we also know that the primitive area of the brain sees things from the worst possible perspective. It is a very negative thinker. Yeah? And again, when we're standing in front of the polar bear, that's really useful. Because we don't want to be optimistic. We don't want to be thinking, polar bear's probably eaten, I'll be alright. No, we've got to think worst case scenario. That damn thing's hungry, I'm its next dinner, I have to get the hell out of here. Yeah? Again, useful when we're standing in front of the polar bear, not useful when that thought that we're trying not to have has come back into our heads, and now we're thinking, I'm not going to be able to get rid of that thought. I can't stop thinking about it. What's this repetitive thought is going? So it's obsessional, it's vigilant, it sees things from the worst possible perspective. It is also not an intellect. It cannot take a look at any given situation and come up with an appropriate response in the way the intellectual area of the brain can. It will just rely on a previous pattern of behaviour. What did I do last time? I just had the same thought over and over and over again. Or I switched the light switch on and off 15 times before I left the room. Or I washed my hands 6 times before I ate a bag of crisps. Yeah? Or I ate the bag of crisps with a fork. Yeah? That worked for me last time. Mm-hmm. And the primitive areas of the brain's definition of whether something works or not is whether we survived it. If we survived it, it must have worked, it's useful. And so we develop these patterns of behaviour which we just continually refer back to over and over and over again. And of course these patterns of behaviour can be incredibly frustrating. They can be the very patterns that we don't want to have. But in order to try and stop them, sometimes it's like saying, don't run away from the polar bear. We've done this 1,000 times, it works, let's do it again. Yeah? So it becomes very, very difficult to break those previous patterns of behaviour. So what is it then that causes that sense of anxiety that moves us from the intellectual into the primitive? As I said before, it is typically negative thinking. And these are the negative thoughts that we are either consciously aware of, but also those ones which we're not consciously aware of and are happening in the subconscious. Every time we have a negative thought, it is converted into anxiety. And we say that is stored and accumulated in the proverbial stress bucket. stress bucket fills up, stress bucket overflows. Yeah. Now the brain doesn't know the difference between what's happening in reality and what's happening in our imagination. So we can negatively forecast the future. Well, I can't possibly go for that promotion at work because my OCD will just be bad and I'll not be able to get to the interview. Or negatively retrospect about the past. I wish I had said this, I wish I hadn't said that, I wish I had done this, I wish I hadn't done that. But all the time that we're doing that, we are filling up the stress bucket. The fuller the stress bucket gets, the more difficult it is to stay out of the primitive area of the brain. The more difficult it is to stay out of the primitive area of the brain, the more we are responding within the primitive opt-out clauses of depression, anxiety and anger, the more we're doing the obsessions, the more we're being vigilant, the more we're seeing things from the worst possible perspective, and the more we're reverting to the very same previous patterns of behaviour which we're desperately trying to stop happening. Which fills up the stress bucket in turn. The beauty is, though, that we do have a way of emptying our stress bucket. And that is REM sleep. So during REM sleep is a particular phase of sleep. During REM sleep, we rerun the events of the day, of the week, of the month, of the year, or whatever, of the decade in many respects. We rerun those events and the brain is trying to make sense of them. The brain is trying to work them through. And in so doing, it moves those memories from the primitive area of the brain, where they're first stored, and moves them into the intellectual area of the brain, where they become what's called a narrative memory. And we know something's moved into the intellectual area of the brain and it's become a narrative memory because that nasty experience or thought process or whatever we can think about, and it's no longer got any emotional attachment to it. Yeah? So a good example of this is, people might be able to relate to this. They have an argument with their boss at work, which really frustrates them and upsets them. They go home, they speak to their partner or the mum or the brother or the sister, and the friend says, just forget about it. Don't worry about it. Don't let it bother you. But they can't. And they're thinking about it until they go to sleep. They have a good night's sleep. They wake up in the morning and they have either completely forgotten about it or they're saying something like, yeah, why do I let my boss upset me so much? It's not a problem. So REM sleep empties out the stress bucket. Now I like to fondly imagine that I wake up with a completely empty stress bucket. If I wake up with a completely empty stress bucket, I have to go a very, very long way during the day for that stress bucket to be filled up to the point where it is starting to cause me some issues. Yeah? The emptier the stress bucket, the more likely we are to be in the intellectual area of the brain. The more likely we are to be in the intellectual area of the brain, the more likely we are to be taking a look at any given situation and coming up with an appropriate response. So the trick then is to work towards emptying out the stress bucket. Let me tell you a little bit about the physiology of the brain, and this is where certain people who are on certain medications, this means a lot to them because they can understand how these medications start to work. Cavemen and women got a very definite reward for carrying out certain evolutionary behaviours. So if they went out and they hunted and they gathered and they supported themselves and their family, they got a very definite reward. If they interacted positively with other members of the tribe, they got a very definite reward. And scientists are adamant about this, and they very definitely would have felt that reward in the form of feeling more motivated, feeling braver, feeling more confident, feeling more in control, both of their own thought processes, but also more in control of their own life. That reward even helped them cope with physical pain. It enabled those early man, early woman to cope with the day-to-day drudgery of being a caveman or woman. Just cope with the day-to-day ins and outs of everyday life. So what was that reward? That reward was a chemical response in the brain which results in the release of certain neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitter we talk about the most, simply because it is the most important, is serotonin. The vast majority of anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication prescribed in this country inflates the amount of serotonin in the body and the brain. In the body and the brain. So if you imagine that we have got depression down here. Down here there's not enough of the right kind of chemicals being released into the body and brain. Up here we have anxiety, where there's too many of the wrong kind of chemicals being released. Too much cortisol, too much adrenaline, too many of the wrong kind of neurotransmitters. All the time that we get a nice constant flow of serotonin, we stay in this bit. All the time we are in this bit, we are in intellectual control. All the time that we are in intellectual control, we can take a look at any given situation and come up with an appropriate response. If we're taking a look at any given situation, coming up with an appropriate response, we are producing more serotonin, and so we start to move into a positive spiral rather than a negative one. Now obviously we don't have to go out and hunt and gather in order to feed ourselves and all of that kind of thing, but like early man and woman, what we do have to make sure that we are doing is plenty of positive thinking, taking plenty of positive actions, and having plenty of positive interactions. All the time we are doing that, we get that nice constant flow of serotonin, which moves us into the intellectual area of the brain and moves us into that positive spiral. Make sense?
Yeah.
Good.
Awesome.
Good.
That was really interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
That's really,
I think
really
it's going to make a great video, to be honest. So.